higher your affective response during exercise, the more that predicts you're going to be doing exercise 6 and 12 months down the line.
When they have a down day, they're less likely to do physical activity. When they're feeling good that day, they're more likely to do physical activity. So it's interesting that there are these two approaches to understanding incidental affect: self-paced physical activity and helping people to be more in tune with the interoceptive qualities of how they feel while they're being active is going to be more important than prescriptive physical activity.
Before we dive into today's episode of the Mental Wellbeing College, an important disclaimer. We do dive into the weeds of mental health, which means that at times we discuss sensitive topics like suicide, self-harm, and substance abuse. If hearing such discussion does bring up distress for you, please do seek the psychological and professional treatment that you need. The content covered in this episode is not intended as a substitute for professional mental health treatment. Hello everybody and welcome back to the show. Today we are joined by Ryan Rhodes, Professor in Exercise Science and Director of the Behavioural Medicine Lab at the University of Victoria. And we're discussing all things affect in exercise. So when we talk about affect, we're talking emotions, mood, feelings of enjoyment and displeasure versus feelings of not enjoying it and pleasure in exercise. This is a really important consideration given how enjoyable and pleasurable you find exercise predicts how much exercise you'll be doing 6 and 12 months down the line. We also cover how you can actually make exercise more enjoyable so that you can make it a consistent behavior in your life and unlock all the wonderful benefits of mental health that exercise brings that we've covered in previous episodes, like treating depression, reducing anxiety, improving your cognitive and brain function and health. So if this episode brings you value, and indeed if you're interested in deep dives on all things lifestyle psychiatry, make sure you hit follow and or subscribe to the Mental Wellbeing College. We've got some really exciting episodes coming up in September, including our second ever episode on all things nutritional psychiatry, a deep dive into what the guidelines for exercising for mental health are, and we're having on a guest who's doing some really important, impactful work on lifestyle interventions for people with serious mental illness. Thanks so much for tuning in, and now to today's episode with Professor Ryan Rhodes on affect in exercise. Professor Ryan Rhodes, welcome to the Mental Wellbeing College.
Oh, thanks very much. Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely fantastic to have you on all the way from Canada. We'll be talking all things affect in exercise. And for me, Ryan, this is a very underestimated, under-talked about topic when it comes to behavior change, exercise change. Usually in my circles, at least, we talk about exercise in terms of the benefits, and this is why you should do it. If you're not doing it, it's going to help you with your mental health, your physical health, diabetes, etc. But we often leave out the picture of affect. And before we dive too deep into what affect is, etc., is that your experience as well? Do you feel like it's an under talked about topic?
Yeah, so I've been now doing this type of research for almost quarter of a century. And when I came into this field, we definitely were focused more on the rational models, trying to understand the promote physical activity and promote motivation through all those great benefits that happen long-term for physical activity. And there's really been a pivot, I would say, in the last 15 years to better try to understand feelings and affect and how that may actually work alongside or even perhaps more important than the more rational motives for something like physical activity.
Yeah, okay, cool. So it sounds like from a research point of view, it's actually shifting and you're seeing more and more of the affect side of things come up, which is really great to see. And I suppose we should dive into what affect is, because I think it's a term that perhaps is not used as much in lay circles. So from your point of view, from a research point of view, what do we mean when we say affect, Ryan?
Yeah, so the affect literature is quite a tangled web. But, if we're thinking of something like basic affect, it's a neurobiological state. It sort of manifests in 3 different ways. It'll manifest with sort of physiological patterns, such as maybe the release of hormones and various physiological kind of heart rate, things like that. It can also manifest in kind of non-volitional behavioral factors. So, something like fear, we might speak differently. We might have facial expressions around affect that are non-volitional. And then one of the big ways that it's represented would be in the subjective experiences of feelings, pleasure, displeasure, sadness, happiness, things like that. And so affect is this sort of broad network of these three types of things. Now, where I and many of the exercise researchers have spent most of our research time is on this sort of subjective experience of feelings. But what makes affect particularly convoluted too is that affect proper is the in situ or the right in the moment feelings.
Right.
But when we talk about affect, we're often also talking about our thoughts about our feelings. So things like, will exercise be enjoyable? Will it be pleasant? That's not actually the affect per se, because you're not there yet. But it's so related to affect that we almost have to keep those types of things in consideration as well. And so that's what makes it a bit of a tangled web to understand. So we've got like affect proper that I described, and then we've got affect related constructs.
Right. So in trying to understand this, my thinking was that affect proper, as you described it, is when you're actually doing it, when you're kind of in a time sense, you're actually doing the activity. But if you're before the activity or you're after the activity, reflecting on it or predicting how you'll feel, that's more the cognitive thought judgments of your affect. Is that correct?
Exactly. Thoughts about feelings. Yeah. Which are equally important because they're kind of related, right? Because it still is in there. So when we're studying it in terms of physical activity or health behavior, we have to consider both of those. Yeah.
Okay. So an example of affect proper might be someone then going into the gym, squatting, and how they're feeling in the moment whilst they're actually squatting, and they might be thinking, this just sucks and I wish I was anywhere but here, and this is so unpleasant, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, to try and disentangle this, one of my colleagues, David Williams, and one of his colleagues had developed what's called an affective and health behavior framework. And they kind of tried to come up with 4 major areas of affect to help describe this. And they came up with kind of 2 of the affect proper that you discussed. And it's exactly what you said. So one of them would be the affective response to a bout of physical activity. So you're right there, you're doing your squats. How do you feel? And then related to that sometimes can be how we feel after exercise as well, which we can talk about how these things relate to each other. And then the other type of in the moment affect that we're interested in physical activity is what we call incidental affect. So it's not really about the activity, but it's kind of like the luggage we carry around in the day. So how good has your day been? How bad is your day? What kind of a mood are you in? That type of thing. And how that may affect whether or not you follow through with your physical activity.
Okay. Lots of different components of affect, which let's double click on. And particularly in terms of how they relate to exercise, what are the important components of affect that relate to exercise, in particular into doing more exercise? Because obviously exercise and physical activity levels, unfortunately, are not where they should be, in the sense that many people recognize the benefits of exercise, but many aren't doing them. I think the latest results globally are about 1/3 of the population is physically inactive and not meeting physical activity guidelines, and that's when you use self-report measures, and arguably it's even worse.
You put an accelerometer on people, it gets even worse.
Exactly.
And that number is even worse in some of the high-income countries.
Right.
So we just got Canadian representative data, for example, and it's about 50% are meeting guidelines with self-report.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So pretty stark, this difference.
Stark, and obviously a behavior that we have to try to figure out, because not very many people are, well, at least half the population are not doing it, and it's despite all these great benefits that you commented on. So I can sort of I'll walk through maybe the 4 components. So as you mentioned, there's the affective response either during or right after exercise, and when we think of that, that's actually fairly well studied now, and it's an interesting series of studies that have looked at that, because what we've shown is that there's when we're engaging in high intensity exercise, there's actually quite a bit of homogeneity. Most people just don't like it. It's not pleasant, right? But when we move into more of that moderate intensity, there's actually a lot of variability on how people feel.
Okay.
So some people feel pretty decent, and they are having a positive experience with moderate type exercise, where some people are still not feeling that it's very good. When we assess affect post-exercise, everyone likes it. So we call this sometimes an affect rebound. So that has been fairly well established at this point.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And then with incidental affect, so this is this affect that you carry around like luggage. We've also found that when you're not feeling particularly positive in the day, it is predictive of not following through with physical activity. And then the other two types of affect we've already kind of discussed. One would be that sort of thoughts about your feelings. And we know that thoughts about those feelings, so in other words, whether you're going to enjoy it, whether you're going to find it pleasant, it's quite highly predictive of physical activity, and so very important. And the last one that we haven't really spoken about is this kind of idea of below our radar kind of motivation. So it's stuff that we don't consciously know, but ultimately it's our kind of approach avoidance system. And this is very much around our hedonic drive. So we very much like to approach pleasure and kind of run away from displeasure. So even though we know that something might be good for us, if it's ultimately not a pleasant experience, we're less likely to follow through with it. And so that's related to how that affective response to physical activity translates into our future performance.
Okay. And in terms of the affect that we feel during exercise, Ryan, it seems like that's very important as to predicting whether or not we will continue to engage in exercise.
Right.
So what I've seen, I think, is some of the work more by yourself and Andrew Cates, David Williams, showing that the more the higher your affective response during exercise, the more that predicts you're going to be doing exercise 6 and 12 months down the line. Yeah. So in terms of affect after exercise, though, does that, if we're, say, feeling good or, unpleasant during exercise, but then, like you said, afterwards, we're reflecting on it and thinking, that was great, the affective rebound, does that have any impact on whether we'll do exercise in the future or not?
The affect we feel during is the most predictive and can predict 6 months to 12 months down the line. How we feel after, we all agree is pretty good, but unfortunately that's not usually associated with continuation of physical activity. And that's probably from our sort of, when we think of operant conditioning, the experience you have before you're going to do something, before a positive experience is going to be the most powerful. So if you have to go through a negative experience before you get to that positive feeling, it's that less positive that is driving whether you're going to do the behavior again.
Yeah, okay. Hello everyone, a quick break from today's episode. At the Mental Wellbeing College, we are committed to the goal of communicating evidence-based wellbeing strategies out to the broader community. The goal of this podcast is to bridge a gap between self-help material and peer-reviewed research by providing evidence-based discussion that respects the nuances of psychology but is digestible for all audiences. Ultimately, I hope that you as a listener feel empowered after each episode so that you can take away and implement strategies to improve your own mental well-being. If you have gained value from this episode of the Mental Wellbeing College, I would be so grateful if you were to hit subscribe or follow, or to share this episode with someone that you love. This is how we continue to grow the show, get the message out, and to impact people in need by providing such information and strategies. Thanks so much for tuning in. It means a lot to us here at the Mental Wellbeing College. And now back to today's episode. And then I suppose it begs the question in terms of, why is it that some people are able to continue to exercise and maintain that as a habit, as a behavior, and others have that kind of intention-behaviour gap where they, have recognition of the benefits of exercise but can't make it a habit and a continuous behavior? What's the role of affect here in that bridging that gap?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there are multiple affective constructs, there's probably multiple roles of affect in that intention-behavior gap. So as you pointed out, this is a big issue around physical activity, healthy eating. Basically, all those things we have with our New Year's resolutions, they have this problem called the intention-behavior gap, where we have this idea that we're going to change the behavior, and then within a few weeks, we've kind of given up on it, even though we had this great intention. So I've been very interested in studying this because it does appear to be around 50%, but for new people new to physical activity, it's even higher than that. The gap is around 70% or so. So it's really problematic. We have these good intentions that we don't follow through. In terms of affect, what we have found is that it is a very important predictor of that intention-behavior gap, particularly compared to all the reasons we hold for physical activity. So, for example, the how much you believe it's going to improve your health, improve your weight control, and reduce chronic disease. These have a lot to do with the creation of the initial intention, and they have almost nothing to do with the follow-through. But how you feel about physical activity, whether it's going to be enjoyable or not, is typically linked to that follow-through. It's also linked to whether you form the intention, but it's linked to that follow-through. So clearly it's an affective issue when it's linking physical activity, intentions, and behavior. The other thing we have some evidence with is that incidental affect piece kicks in again around intention behavior. So we can have the best of intentions, but when we're not feeling particularly positive in a day, that can derail those positive intentions. And so we have to think in terms of both the experience of physical activity as well. How can we deal with these incidental daily affect in order to follow through with our intentions? So we've had work in our lab trying to focus on both of these, and understand these factors.
Really interesting, that incidental affect piece, because, at least anecdotally, a lot of people will self-report that the reason they exercise is to help with their mood, to help with their stress. But then, like you're saying as well, higher levels of stress on a particular day may preclude someone from actually engaging in exercise. So there's almost kind of like two sides to that coin. Yeah,
there's actually kind of two hypotheses around how incidental affect and something like physical activity work. So one is generally considered the affective regulation hypothesis, which is this idea that on days that you don't feel very good, you use physical activity to make yourself feel better. That there is some evidence for that in a clinical setting. Athletes might be able to use that, sometimes very regular exercisers. But it's actually the other hypothesis, which is much more that there's congruence between how you feel and what you do. And I think that the evidence would suggest that's much more around people who are just starting physical activity, who are less invested in physical activity. So when they have a down day, they're less likely to do physical activity. When they're feeling good that day, they're more likely to do physical activity. So it's interesting that there are these two approaches to understanding incidental affect, and it depends a little bit with your experiences with physical activity. So if you've been regularly active, you might actually say, I'm not feeling that great, I need my workout. But when people are starting, it's usually, I don't feel that good, I don't want to do that.
Right. Is that because of those learned associations? If you're a regular exerciser, maybe you've got the reps under your belt where it's been a positive experience, and you can draw upon that to say, okay, this is actually going to help me in my lower mood state. Whereas if you're just an early adopter.
That's probably why that's happening.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So that point earlier as well that you were bringing up, Ryan, about the differences between someone just starting out and someone maintaining exercise. Is it that the rational, reasoned approach, the benefits of exercise helps more on the intention, the initial intention phase, whereas maintaining it, you need that level of a positive affective experience to go with the rational benefits?
Yeah, that's a good point. So we've tried to understand the sort of the process of developing an intention and then translating that intention, and what are some of the differences between these. And so my work has been trying to understand that. And the differences are fairly subtle. So it's not a completely, here are the determinants of forming an intention, and then here are completely different determinants of following through. But there does appear to be some differences on that. So as you alluded, issues around all the benefits you're going to get from it that are more long-term, that has a lot more to do with forming the intention in the first place. And if you think about why you say form a New Year's resolution, whether it's to start a new dietary habit or to start physical activity, it's often because of what you're going to get from it in the long term. Where the following through with intention is about what do I get from it right now? And that's where affect comes in. And that's why it's so important to not overlook when we're talking with people about promoting physical activity, to not overlook the experience itself. That should be the main focus, is on the experience itself, that it's going to be a pleasant, a fun, fulfilling, perhaps meaningful experience if you can make it, rather than just this kind of thing you're going to do to attain all these outcomes much later. And so we do have evidence that is important. Self-regulation skills become important when you're going to translate an intention into behavior. So, becoming kind of a master planner, because many of us are quite busy tracking and monitoring. So things like, Apple Watches and Fitbits and stuff like that can be quite useful when you're starting a new program. They're not necessarily the source of creating an intention, but they can help you to kind of regulate your behavior when you're trying to translate it.
Yeah.
And then we've often explored things like the formation of habits, which is how cues can start to stimulate behavior, somewhat underlined from motivation. So you start with motivation, but eventually you're doing this in the same place, in the same context, and eventually the cues kind of prompt the behavior. And so that can help with the intention behavior gap a little bit more. And then one of the other areas that we study in our lab these days is the formation of identity. So this idea of moving from I exercise to I am an exerciser, and how that self-categorization can help with people to say, like, this is now what I do. And from an affect perspective, there's an interesting process that goes on with self-categorization, because now you don't want to actually have that discrepancy between who you think you are and what you're doing and whether or not you're not doing that. So we try to stay concordant with our affect when we do that.
Yeah, a really interesting point. And I did come across that the role of identity and schema that you've obviously looked at quite prolifically with exercise. And the question that came to mind there, which I think is relevant for the audience as well, is it seems that having an exercise identity was associated with doing more exercise, which is great. But how do you get to that point of having that exercise identity, that I am an exerciser? Because for me, for people who are sedentary or not exercising, that still leaves them in the same place, right? Okay, exercise identity is good, but how do I actually get there?
Yeah, so there's one of the big questions, isn't it? That we're working on right now. We're working on, sometimes in first phase research, you're just trying to understand whether something is linked to something else. So as you noted, we have pretty decent evidence now that habits are linked to physical activity, that identity is linked to physical activity. And now a lot of work is being put into, well, then how can we change these? How can we modify them? And as you pointed out, constructs like the development of a habit or the development of an identity do not happen through just a one-day informational seminar. They're experiential.
If only.
And so they can help over time. Yeah, exactly. If only. So there are things that would occur over time, right? But we do have to think of interventions that can help people when they're first starting out, which would not be the identity piece. But we're exploring certain things that can help along the way to expedite identity and habit.
Yeah. Okay. So you bring us to a really, really pertinent point as well about interventions. So to give you an audience a bit of context, Ryan, I'm doing my PhD with the project centered mostly around how can we get trained psychologists here in Australia to use exercise to help with the mental health of their patients, their clients. There's a huge body of evidence supporting this, as good effects as antidepressant medication and psychotherapy for depression, good effects for schizophrenia, anxiety disorders, etc. But psychologists are not trained in using this. I went through my whole 6-year training as a psychologist. Exercise was barely mentioned at all. And when we talked about health behavior change theories, we really come at it from a more rational reason, kind of cognitivist approach. These are the reasons why try and get your clients to get to a certain stage of attitudes and thoughts about their exercise, nothing about affect. So my question to you is how can health practitioners in general, could be mental health practitioners or physicians, use affect with their clients to actually change exercise behavior, given the importance that we've already spoken about of it in exercise?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is where much of the research is right now.
Okay.
So, the answers I give at the moment may change in the next 10 years, because this is where a lot of the grants are being funded and where the research is to try to understand how we can harness, affect to help promote physical activity. But there's a few things we do know right now. So for example, when we're thinking about something like the affective response to physical activity, we have a pretty good idea that self-paced physical activity and helping people to be more in tune with the interoceptive qualities of how they feel while they're being active is going to be more important than prescriptive physical activity. So physical activity where you just say, hey, do it at this intensity, don't worry about it, it's going to be good for you kind of thing, or any of that type of stuff. Training people more to be interoceptive around their self-pace of physical activity is going to be important for that affective response. And then people can kick it up as they go, as they're feeling better. Because as we've mentioned, this comes back to really affect long-term adherence. So it's even though someone says, well, that was a great workout, I'm feeling great, if the physical activity itself was not a very pleasant experience, it's likely that there's going to be some challenges getting the person regular in terms of physical activity. So we know that the affective response is very important to consider with clients right away. And sometimes it's not something people think about. Obviously, the other piece that has received quite a bit of research now is looking at ways at trying to make the experience more enjoyable. So this can be various things. This can be from the activity itself to make sure that the activity is engaging. It could be that the activity is meaningful. So getting people to do things, I study, as you mentioned before we started this podcast, I've studied things like dog walking, like getting out with a dog, and in a much more of a social environment, perhaps, can be helpful for people to get going. So there's meaning beyond just yourself going for a walk. Now you're doing something, for example, with a dog or with a friend. And so that can be very helpful, or even maybe tying physical activity to other meaningful activities like walking to the store to get groceries and things like that, where there's purpose to it, can be helpful. Now these are manipulating a little bit sometimes outside of the affect domain, but they're trying to get at a sense of some feelings around it that aren't that it's just drudgery around exercise, for example. And then there's also research looking into how we can help people to experience physical activity differently. So there's some work around mindfulness. And if you're coming from psychology, some of the applied acceptance and commitment approaches to understanding physical activity. So the idea of understanding incidental affect and your feelings, but ultimately not always just being completely dictated by them. So you can recognize that these are my feelings, but I still want to move in a valued direction, and I intended to do this, and it's going to feel better to move in a much more of a valued and centered approach. So there's some evidence around helping people to understand their feelings and then move in much more of an intentional manner can be helpful for promoting physical activity with that incidental affect piece.
Okay. Do you have an example with the kind of acceptance and commitment-based approach? Because that's new to me, and certainly acceptance and commitment therapy is something that I lean on a lot with clients, but I haven't really used it in the exercise domain. Can we double click on that as to what that might look like with a bit of an example?
Yeah. So we just had a study published where the population we were interested in intervening with physical activity were early career professionals.
Okay.
And so, people early in their career, of course, you might know something about this. It's a challenging time in life. There's lots going on. There's often relocation. There's pretty heavy work hours. Sometimes there's marriage and family related things and all this kind of stuff. And so we chose that population because we thought incidental affect could be quite present. You're beholden to other types of activities in the day. And so blowing off physical activity when you start to get tired and things like that is going to be highly prevalent. Lots of other populations where that could be the case, but that was the one we were interested in. Mm-hmm. And so we had a 6-week training course on acceptance and commitment about understanding your feelings around physical activity. We started with understanding values and valued behaviors and where does physical activity fit in terms of what you're trying to change. And then working through a series of techniques that would be similar probably to what you're familiar with about understanding the basics of affect and then understanding how one can basically diffuse from those feeling states to then move into the intended physical activity behavior. We showed in this particular study that it was quite effective and that people also found the intervention enlightening because they hadn't thought of it that way. And the reason that's important is that it kind of comes back to what you were saying originally with a lot of our rationalist interventions, is that if someone comes in wanting to change their behavior and you try to sell them on all its benefits, they've often heard of that. And so it's kind of like, okay, great. I already know that. I have an intention. That's why I came in the door in the first place. So helping people with some of these acceptance and commitment skills has been kind of helpful that way because it's new information and new ways to look at it for people.
Yeah, I love that. That sounds really, really novel. I'll certainly look into that more because I can see a lot of utility from that. And I suppose drawing on what you're saying, what I see a lot of is the exercise as medicine approach. And like you said, most people, the vast majority already recognize that the benefits of exercise. They don't need to necessarily be told that exercise is medicine. They already understand that. But I think for me, it's less about educating people on this is such an effective medicine. No, you need to know the effectiveness of it, and more about how do we make this medicine more digestible so that they're actually going to take something they already know is beneficial for them. I think that's the analogy that I find a lot of utility from.
Yes.
Yeah. So coming back to the interventions, you mentioned things like the self-regulated intensity and allowing them to go kind of at their own pace. Is the real key here autonomy and choice of all the factors, whether you do it outside, inside, the intensity, the type? Is that really the approach that a health practitioner should take, is leaning on all these different variables of exercise, but drawing them out from the client's perspective and leaning on their expertise as to what their own preferences are? Or is it more nuanced?
Yeah, it's a good point you raise. I think that is obviously very important with a focus on whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, and people's sort of introception within their states of how they're feeling at the time.
Yeah.
And so that's particularly where the focus is right now, on trying to both increase the sense of enjoyment, but also increase that sort of affective response to physical activity. Because we know that these things are going to come back and be very powerful, so we need to focus on them. And I think there's so having practitioners focus and help clients think about these really moves away from the long-term benefits that someone may have started to come in and say they wanted to get active for, or that they lean toward right away. And so making sure that experience itself is as positive as possible, I think, is where practitioners can help the client.
Yeah. Okay. Are there any particular models that are out yet as to how practitioners can actually go about having these conversations? Is it more of a motivational interviewing approach? Is it drawing on a particularly different theory or model where they can use sort of a framework in a session with a client to draw out the more affectively pleasing exercise experiences?
Yeah, so it's like all of psychology, there's no limitation in models that are out there for this. So there are different approaches. So one that you kind of mentioned around autonomy would be the self-determination theory focus on autonomy, relatedness, and a sense of competence. Hoping to build towards some form of intrinsic motivation if possible. So that type of looking at those building blocks and behavior change tactics around that. from a social cognitive perspective, if we're looking at something like enjoyment, again, the focus would be on some of the things that you mentioned: context, social support, and a focus on personal preferences for physical activities. I mean, one of the things also for people to consider is to try a bunch of physical activities to see what they're most interested in or what seems to jive with them. I mean, this is anecdotal, but often I've said to clients, well, if you didn't like the gym last year, chances are you won't like it this year. So we've got to find some other things to do and give other things a try. So looking at trying different activities first to figure out what might be the best fit for that person. And it's not always what's the most convenient. It's what you actually find at least pleasant to do.
Yeah, no, really, really love that. Really sound advice. And I think that's the beauty of exercise, particularly these days, right? We have a huge gamut of different activities that people can sample from. And often it is that trial and error sampling of those different activities that's required. Yeah. Fantastic, Ryan. This has been such a really cool, free-ranging, but important conversation. Like you said, on a really, what I feel is an underutilized, under-talked about topic, particularly from a healthcare perspective. Are there other tips that you'd like to share, finally, either with health practitioners or with clients, people, individuals themselves trying to make exercise more consistent?
Oh, yeah. So, one of the other things to think about is potentially looking at, for people who just don't love physical activity, because there probably is an upper end to how much you're really going to like it. We're hoping to find that for some people, they can at least find it, moderately pleasant. But they're likely, for many people, there's going to be always a better selection in terms of something more enjoyable. We certainly have been interested in ways in helping people, again, to identify with the value of that behavior and that choice, but also to perhaps think about something like habit formation if you're having challenges with the sort of intrinsic motivation of something like physical activity. And so habit formation is a way of, getting people primed to do something within the same context. Time of day is a great way of doing it. So for example, after morning coffee, go for a walk, or after dinner, that's when you do your activity. And so chaining it to an event that doesn't happen too frequently, but that you can ultimately prime with that. And that seems to be reasonably effective because as something becomes more habitual, we think about it less. But that also means we may not worry about the enjoyment part of it as much. Okay. And so there have been some interesting studies around looking at building habits particularly for people who don't intrinsically love a particular behavior, but just get used to, this is something I do during the day.
So if you don't love it, it's in your best interest for it to become automatic so that it's just, like you said, habitual and it's done without having to go through that conscious deliberation of something you don't actually enjoy.
Exactly. Like it might be to help reduce some of the conscious deliberation around it. I mean, we can never truly habituate something as complicated as physical activity, but we can make it feel a little bit easier and less burdensome. There will be little parts of it that can be habituated.
Yeah. Okay. So, and obviously habit psychology, I mean, it's a whole, huge gamut in and of itself, but you mentioned a couple of really important tips there, tying it to... Yeah. You mentioned that tying it to a specific behavior after your morning coffee, looking at a particular kind of time of day. Are there other kind of, higher order, top level tips that you'd want to share to help people make exercise habitual?
Yeah, for people who are struggling with it, there is some evidence that having it earlier in the day makes it seems to stick a little bit better. There's probably one of those things is that less has gone on in your day that's made it more complicated. And so that could be part of it. So there's a little less self-regulation needed if you start earlier in the day. And the other is there does seem to be a little bit more ease around habit formation because, you can tie it to a very early habit in the day.
Yeah, did not know that. So as the day goes on and the stressors...
But again, this is for people who are struggling.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Really interesting. Okay, fantastic. No, really appreciate that. Ryan, I think lots of really useful practical tips for people in terms of making exercise habitual, but also iterating on your current exercise patterns to make it more affectively pleasing. So really appreciate you, sharing a lot of the tips that you have today. Yeah, is there anything finally that you'd want to share with listeners?
No, I think we've covered most of the affect-related material. It's an ongoing area of research, and it's a very interesting area of research because it's so complicated. But I'm hoping we can kind of crack the code over the next 10 years or so and have some very tangible recommendations.
Yeah, really looking forward to watching this space unfold. And actually, for health practitioners, something just came to mind. You have a really wonderful book, which I'm trying to get my hands on. I think it's Affective Determinants in Health Behavior with David Williams and Mark Connor. So I might link that in the show notes for the psychologists and health practitioners listening. I've been trying to get my hands on that, but I think it's a print to order, isn't it? Like, rather than stocked in bookshelves.
I guess it is now. Yeah. Yeah. It's an edited book. So we have chosen lots of different authors on different areas of affect and health behavior.
Right.
And it was sort of the first compilation of its kind on this important area.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Fantastic. I'll put that in the show notes for health practitioners. But yeah, awesome, Ryan. Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode of the Mental Wellbeing College. If you've made it this far, it means you've gleaned a ton of value from today's episode, or you've fallen asleep. I sincerely hope that it's the former, and if it is, I would be so grateful if you were to hit subscribe, follow, or to share this podcast with someone you care about. Our mission here at the Mental Wellbeing College is to provide a free and accessible resource for people to take action and implement to improve their own mental wellbeing. And you subscribing, following, and or sharing helps us to achieve that mission and to impact people in need. Thanks so much for tuning in. It means a lot. We'll see you next week on the Mental Wellbeing College.